Beautiful. The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas. This evening, we are pleased to have Sarah Zapata joining us. Sarah Zapata, born in Corpus Christi, Texas, is an artist and writer based in Brooklyn, New York. She has held solo exhibitions with Performance Space New York, Deli Gallery, El Museo del Barrio, amongst others. Her work has been exhibited at the New Museum, the Museum of Art and Design, the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, Boston University, LAXART, Paul Kasmin, Arsenal Contemporary, EFA Project Space, and the Hudson Valley LGBTQ Community Center. Zapata has also completed residencies at the Museum of Art and Design, MoCA, AZ West, and Wave Hill. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sarah. You may now begin sharing your screen.
Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. I'm gonna share screen. Okay, it was such a pleasure to see some of the students today. It was really wonderful conversation and great to see a lot of exciting work and that people are doing okay in the pandemic. I'm gonna start with some student work, which is absolutely embarrassing, but important to talk about. I think it's really great to talk about your trajectory and also see what I was thinking about when I first was in school. So I'm originally from Texas, as Jill stated. I went to the University of North Texas and I studied fibers, which was a really great sort of technical education where my concentration was in weaving. So I began weaving because my father's from Peru, and so it was a way for me to sort of understand my relationship to that culture and really sort of investigate my identity within them through the lens of textiles. So this is a weaving where it's a dyed warp, and there's like a supplemental sort of warp where you can weave on only the top layer of the fabric. And this is interesting for sure. But basically my last year, I became really interested in telephone books. And they were everywhere. They were sort of seemingly to be really obsolete. And it was a material that was abundant and free. So I was really interested in also this material and its availability, but also what it represented. It was obviously something that was very important prior to the internet, but then became very obsolete. So I became really romanced in the sort of narrative of the telephone book as sort of this allegory of an object that was losing importance in relation to the digital age. So this incredibly blurry photo, I apologize, is weavings of the telephone book paper. I think I have a better image of it. But basically, so I would cut the telephone book pages into these strips and then place them into my warp in the loom and basically like hand lay every single strip to create this sort of like paper textile. And it was very meticulous work, but I loved it. And I was really interested in sort of how I could continue to manipulate this material to create a multitude of different surfaces. So here's another sort of image of this work. I was taking the paper and crumpling it and just hot gluing it into these like shadow boxes. I really was into shadow boxes. I thought they were amazing. And so I was painting the pages and sort of trying to use the inherent color of them, but then also cut some of the spines of the books. So it was sort of this narrative of like the book's sort of escaping into like anonymity and essentially becoming trash. And so this was sort of like the final piece within like that sort of shadow box trajectory. And so it was kind of creating this landscape with the books, which some of them were cut out, and there were lights and like these little wooden dowels. And so I really wanted to create this sort of cityscape of detritus. And I was very interested in sort of this like excessive sort of narrative that could be created with the same material. This is, again, another blurry photo, so sorry, but this is basically I took the pages and I was crumpling them into small pieces and then gluing each of them together. There's not an armature that's inside of this piece. And then it was covered in sort of this like resin and plaster and painted. And so to kind of reference the body, but again, another material exploration of what this material could be. And so these were sort of the last pieces that I did right before I left Texas. And these were making paper from the telephone book paper that was broken down and then used on top of other handmade paper, and then experimenting with ink and like a soldering gun, but just to sort of explore these sort of territories. And also I will mention with some of these sort of shadow boxes, I was also interested in these church bride complexes, which were architectural plans for mental institutions in the United States. The sort of like incredibly ornate sort of Gothic institutions where it was thought of beauty being one of the main medicines for people who are institutionalized. And so I wanted to mimic a lot of those shapes that were in the church bride complexes, but you can sort of see how I'm trying to reference architecture through textiles and sort of like fibrous materials. So after I left Texas, I moved a few months after I graduated from undergrad. I moved to New York. And this was the first piece that I had done. I literally moved with telephone books. I do not know why, it's like so idiotic, but I was so attached to the material and I was convinced that I was going to be a telephone book paper artist. Like that was my lane. And so I had fortunately received a grant from the Dallas Museum of Art right as I had graduated to purchase my own loom, which all of you, I am a firm believer in grants. You will see as we continue, but always apply for grants. Funding is incredibly important, and applications are a way to really fine tune how you talk about your work. But so I was fortunate enough to have, I had a little folding loom that I kept in my apartment, and this was sort of this first exploration where I was really trying to figure out what work I wanted to make when I moved. So here's another piece. This is again hand-woven telephone book paper, and I'm trying to sort of figure out what I want. And the black shag is unraveled sort of cord that I had received when I was interning for these artists when I first moved. Basically, when I first moved to New York, I needed to get in any way that I could. So I first interned at like an art fair, and then from that got an internship with these two design artists who were really generous in their materials. They gave me a lot of materials that I didn't have money for. And they also really showed me that you can be as excessive as you want. I think for some reason, I was really nervous about going all the way. And during school, I was incredibly afraid of color. I did not like to use it. The telephone book paper was a way for me really to escape having to author any sort of color within my work. So this is another odd wall hanging. These are sort of just like hand coiled like balls basically that are like pinned to one another with more unraveled rope. So as you can see, I was very confused as to what I wanted to do when I first got out of school. I moved and I knew that I wanted to be an artist, but I was seeing a lot of work that people were making, and I felt almost embarrassed that I was working with textiles. A lot of my peers were making these like very precious sort of like assemblages of trash and like these very sort of specific like artfully placed like cans or specific objects. And so I was trying to sort of figure out what I wanted to do. And I felt like I really needed to emulate that. So I was trying to really navigate. This is again, other paper, but this time it's dyed with watercolor and blinds that I found on the street. And I felt like I was going in some sort of direction where I was accessing this like other sense of fantasy. So I have been working on this piece, which is, of course, telephone book paper that's painted and then has a rubber mat on it with all of this like long, intricate sort of tails that were cotton yarn that I had found on the street. And so I had been really interested, obviously, in textiles, but it wasn't until I had moved to New York that I was really sort of digesting what my life had been prior to that point. So I was raised as an evangelical Christian, and so I'm also a lesbian. And so I had a lot of guilt that I was dealing with, and sort of being able to live like an out life for the first time, and really being away from Texas and away from sort of this like very strong religious grip. And so a way for me to sort of navigate guilt was to actually have this writing practice of foot erotica. So in the Bible, feet are commonly used to talk about your relationship to Christ, your trajectory through life. They're a sign of humility. But from an anthropological standpoint, they're also what defines us from as humans. We're the only full-time bipedal mammals. And so I loved this sort of contrast that existed within this part of the body. It's also very polarizing. A lot of people are really disgusted by feet, or they're turned on by it. And so I knew that I wanted to work with rugs. So textiles are so related to the body. I wanted to work within those confines and control exactly how they did relate to the body. So this is the first sort of exploration that I had, this like very sort of strange welcome mat, as I called it. But it was meant to sort of be this tongue-in-cheek sort of exploration of a rug. And so this was for a show that was put on by some friends of mine who are art handlers. And the show was called Zip Line, and basically the only time that you would see the work was when it was coming through this zip line through the space. Very much like art handlers really see most of the work most intimately when it's in travel. So I knew that I wanted to do this giant foot, and it was sort of my first exploration into big work. When I was in Texas in school, I could be as large and as toxic as I wanted to. But in New York, space is such a currency. And so it really took some navigating and figuring out how to work at a scale that I was comfortable in again. So instead of trying to run from what I was comfortable in, I instead wanted to really understand my experience and refine it. Honestly, I feel like everything sort of changed for me when I stopped trying to be somebody else. I just realized, like, I work in textiles, this is who I am, it makes sense, and why not just like really dig in. So I started to work with the recurring motif of feet and sort of playing with like that eroticism, but also how it can relate to the body. And so that led to, this was the first sort of shag rug that I did. This was for an installation at my first studio in New York in Bushwick. There's this thing called Bushwick Open Studios. And I think this was 2014. And so it was sort of like a more industry situation. I think now it still occurs, but it like, there's like food trucks, and it's like this very sort of festival sort of situation. But I was lucky enough to be picked up by one of the like art websites roundup. Somehow they found that I was doing this installation. And so they wrote about it, which was wonderful, my first piece of press. So I had created this installation where it was for people to come in and to remove their socks and shoes. And then they could touch the rug and I would film them on these little sculptures. So this was around the time when there was the big scandal with the NSA and sort of harvesting of Americans' information. And there was a program that was created that was actually called Thin Thread, and that was to harvest Americans' information anonymously, which was obviously not used. So I wanted to really play with that sort of idea, and so to take images of people's feet and then to think about authorship and how we don't have authorship over images, and then create basically like a foot porn of these videos. And so this was the feedback that was coming back on these, which was people had a lot of fun and it was very joyful. There was allegedly someone who peed in there. It turned into something else, which was great. And so I wanted to continue referencing the body and to have sort of these very like feminine colors. Again, as I had said, when I was in school, I was very scared of being very colorful, and I really wanted to just go with it. If it was going to be women's work and to be feminine, I wanted to go all the way. And so I wanted to really use these like very beautiful, almost tacky colors of these yarns, and then also have images that are very feminine, but accessing this strange sense of body and fantasy. So these are coiled works, which is a traditional technique of sewing rope on top of itself. And so this was actually used for creating vessels that held water, because it can create a piece that's incredibly structurally sound. So it's all hand done. So fortunately, with the Bushwick Open Studios, when I got a write-up in that website, one of the curators of El Museo del Barrio saw my work and decided to do a studio visit. And from that interaction, over a year later, I was fortunate enough to get a commission for an installation there at El Museo. So there I wanted to do something with like the Shag pieces. This is about 6 by 10 feet. And so this is called Siemprex. And so I wanted to use hand-woven fabric that created these sort of like toenails and had these ponytails and sort of, again, access the strange sense of female fantasy. So this work is based off of the traditional arpilleras, which are present in Chile and Peru. And those were these narrative pieces that were created by women during the Pinochet regime in Chile and then guerrilla occupation in Peru. And so they expressed these really incredible sort of narrative experiences from the women. And so I also wanted to access those with this strange sense of space and scale. And so there's a motif of a woman who's smiling, and that is from a political party in Peru that I found particularly strange and creepy. And I got that I got that image redone in rhinestone transfers, and then was placing it on the weavings and then the nails of the pieces. And the beauty of simple drawings is that it can kind of morph into a bunch of different elements as well. So after that, this is a drawing for an installation that I was lucky enough to receive for the first New York Textile Month when I was in residence at the Museum of Arts and Design. And so I had wanted to create sort of this large environment. I had been sort of skirting around the idea of installation, and I wanted it to be this excessive situation, but I also wanted it to be sculptural. So this is the installation at the window. It was at the Mary Mecco store in Manhattan. And I think of this as a really important sketch where I was trying to figure things out. So this was a way for me really to be excessive and really get into what things would look like if it was a whole environment that was created. So the sculptural piece had all of these other hand weavings and bra cups, hair, and then there was like an armature that was underneath this piece, but I was really trying to turn this into a sculpture, but not really sure how to do that. And so that leads to the first proper solo show that I had. So this was at Deli Gallery in 2017, and this was called If I Could. And so I felt like this was sort of everything leading up to what I had been trying to achieve up to this point. So I knew that I had wanted to create an installation where people could come into the space and touch it. So people had to remove their socks and shoes upon entering the space, perhaps to make them feel uncomfortable, turned on, just a way to sort of change headspace when entering into the environment. From there, they were allowed to sit and spend time in the space, and the sculptures were about the size of a seated body to encourage people to spend time there. When I was working on this show, it was right around the time of the election, so I felt like what people needed at that time was comfort. I think all of us were sort of shocked when Trump got elected, and it was a way sort of to navigate how I was feeling and how I think a lot of people were feeling at the time. So the show is called If I Could, which is named after the song by Simon and Garfunkel that also samples an Andean folk song, El Cantor Pasa. So I liked that it sort of blended these two sensibilities of the Peruvian and the American, but also spoke to this sense of humility. I'm always interested in invoking humility. It's something, again, that's tied to guilt for me, but also I work in these excessive ways, not to be masturbatory as to like, look what I can do, but rather I feel like I need to earn what I'm doing. So in terms of it being about humility, people could come in and spend time with these sculptures. And so the sculptures are modeled after this burial practice from the Paracas civilization, which is a southern Peruvian pre-Columbian civilization. And so they had this incredible way of burial where they would place bodies into a basket and then wrap and wrap and wrap them in textiles, basically to create this womb and to create this idea of leaving and entering the world in the same way by being in this natal position. And so very similarly, I wanted these pieces to be with a coiled base and then covered in textiles that I had made. On the interior of the sculptures is an unseen armature that is a curved steel cross. And so there's two interpretations of what a curved cross can be in biblical text. One is that it's the mark of the beast. In Revelation, it talks about how the Antichrist will show up with a curved cross. It's a mark of the beast. But there's also this interpretation that represents the humility of Christ. So I wanted to have something that was an unseen element on the interior of the sculptures to sort of represent the life force that exists within these pieces. And so from there, these are other coiled works that were done directly after that show. And they're related. I feel like they were made at the same time. And so they exist sort of outside of any installation. And so usually when that happens, I think of these as almost sketches. And so from there, I was invited to be a resident again at the Museum of Arts and Design. They were planning an exhibition that celebrated the 10-year anniversary of their residency program by having an exhibition where they invited 4 artists back to have their studio in the museum. So I had the pleasure of sharing the part of the exhibition with LJ Roberts, who's an incredible trans artist. And they had half of the gallery space as well as I had the half of the gallery space. So coming off of the If I Could show, I wanted to really work architecturally. I had been really interested in the floor and I wasn't done with the floor, but I wanted to sort of create these ruins. And so these are the very simple sort of pine pieces that exist underneath these ruin pieces. And so I wanted to create these pieces that had more sort of representational imagery. I had gotten a tufting gun for the sole purpose of adding another textile element that could be used in a representational means. And so this was also a very different situation where the work was being made on site. And so it was actually, people got to see what it looks like unfinished. And so it then went to an exhibition at Boston University, which I include this image because I truly do not like this staging of this work. And I think that it's important to talk about when work is a failure. And it was an important step for me to really see what was working and what was not. So I think sometimes when you show, you have this understanding that it always has to be perfect and finished. And I don't like to think about work in that way. I think it's important to experiment publicly, and sometimes it's a success and sometimes it's not. So this was that sort of understanding, and we'll see what it looks like a little bit later. This is another image of it. So I think that this was another way where this work was not super planned, and everything else before and after this point was super planned, and it was also an exploration and understanding how I need to work. From there, this is from a performance that was at PS1. And so this was a really fun sort of situation where I was able to set up this environment and then read some foot erotica that I had written, with also a video of my feet in work as well that was projected on top of it. And so I told some of the students today, but I think it's very important to, whenever you have anything, any work, just milk that to its full extent. The video that was projected, I took in my solo show on the last day that it was up, so I could have the sort of document, and then that could be turned into another work as well. There's always ways that you can get work out of existing work. So this was a fun experience where I was able to really have a lot of different elements that existed. I think of my foot erotica almost as going in conjunction with the visual work. Rugs are obviously meant for feet, and it's a practice that had been private for a while, but I now perform readings in conjunction to also activate the work and point to other concepts that exist within the visual work. This is from an exhibition that was at the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art. And so this was another staging of some of the work from If I Could, which was changed. So I like to create installations that are for a specific environment, but they're comprised of pieces. So usually whenever an installation happens, it's never happening again in the exact same way. But I'm not against to having different restagings of the works with different elements or to a different space. So this sculpture then, instead of being on the ground, this was on the wall to create a different sort of situation. And people were able to take their shoes off and then sort of touch the rug that was on the ground. So this is how that finished work ended up being that I had started at the Museum of Arts and Design. This is called To Teach or to Assume Authority. And so this is a work that I had been dreaming of getting to its full potential. And this was a staging of it that I was very happy with. So I wanted these pieces to look like ruins and sort of this strange sense of time that existed. And these ruins were based off of ruins that were in this ceremonial complex in southern Peru called Cahuachi. And so this ceremonial complex had a lot of really incredible sort of architectural buildings in the way that the complex was situated, but what particularly interested me in this complex there found was one of the largest pieces of hand weaving that has been found, so large that archaeologists do not know how it was constructed. And so what it's referenced to is that it's a beautiful sort of depiction of how this community of women worked together to achieve a singular goal. So I wanted to think about those ruins, and then in contrast to its title, which comes from a verse that talks about how women are not to teach or assume authority in the church. And so at that time, obviously churches were sort of the educational systems of the community. And so I wanted to have that sort of contrast that existed with those two lineages. So here's other depictions of this work. And so again, it's this excess of this like sort of fantasy and of this texture. And there's little pieces of hand weaving to also map out different textures within it. And this is work that was not able to be touched. So from there, I needed a break from shag rugs. After that work, I said, I'm never making another shag rug ever again. And so I had my tufting gun and I had started working with it, but really hadn't mastered the technique. It took a little while to become dexterous within it. So I also was still working with these coiled pieces and had begun to get interested in striped cloth. So there's a very interesting sort of lineage that exists within striped cloth. There's biblical text that talks about how one should not wear a fabric that's made of two. And so from the medieval period onward, people who were on the fringes of society were made to wear stripes: prostitutes, jesters, poor people. And from that lineage, we actually get the jail stripe and the American flag. So I wanted to work with this cloth or this idea of a textile, especially if it's considered untrustworthy. So I had been working with these pieces. I knew that I wanted the entire space to be striped and to have these sort of figures that existed within them. I wanted to adorn the space with stripes and then have striped cloth. Let me get to what it looks like. So I had wanted to create this sort of idea of a labyrinth with stripes. I was trying to think of other ways that my work could be activated without physical touch. And so something that I had thought about was sort of the idea of the labyrinth and sort of walking around a space in a specific way as a walking meditation, or dictating how the pilgrim sort of interacts through the space. So there was a particular labyrinth that I had become very interested in. It's in Manhattan. It's at Marble Collegiate Church. And so there's this labyrinth, and it's in Midtown and on Fifth Avenue. And at this church, there was this very flamboyant sort of preacher, Norman Vincent Peale. And he basically was this evangelical preacher who talked about basically the principles of Christianity with the language of advertising, and was sort of this very controversial figure. And come to find out, he was the pastor of Donald Trump. He actually performed his first two marriages, and Donald Trump was a member of this church. So I wanted to think about that labyrinth, and then thinking about the juxtaposition of the stripe and sort of creating this labyrinth for essentially the outcast. So it was a mixture of these tufted works with hand-woven cloth. And then the way that the pieces were arranged in the space was stripes throughout the space as well. And so the figures that are depicted in the tufted pieces came from this civilization in Peru. When I was researching the show, I went to visit my family in Piura, which is in the northern coast of Peru. And afterward, I traveled down the coast by bus by myself and stopped in Lambayeque, which there is this incredible museum that has basically, it's the Lord of Sipan. He's basically called the King Tut of South America. And so there were all these really incredible sort of metallurgy and ceramic faces of trophy heads and different figures. And so they were sort of these like genderless figures that I wanted to use. Really what differentiated them was the genitalia and not the face. So I wanted these pieces to sort of have different depictions of guilt that were coming from these pieces of metal and ceramics. And so I thought of these as being sort of an anti-gender, anti-hero civilization. And so I'm thinking about how in a church where there are stained glass windows flanking the worshiper, what does that look like when perhaps there's darker narratives that are depicted? So I wanted there to be these figures that basically like flanked the viewer as they were coming in. And then there are these ceramic pieces that are basically meant to look like they're kneeling figures that in my mind were so serious, and then they turned out to be these sort of like jovial, sort of like strange figures, but they're like kneeling onto these prayer rugs basically. And so these are actually ceramic, and then they have mannequin feet that are covered in hand-woven fabric. So they're meant to look like my other coiled works, but they're made out of ceramic rather than fiber. And there's other installation. And then after that show, I had sworn off making shag pieces, and then I made another one, like pretty much immediately after I was done with that show. And so this was the first time, like, I think in contrast to these two solo shows, like I was really trying to mitigate the abstract and the representational. And so I was trying to think of how, without being overtly representational, what would that look like if it was color that was used to sort of show the control of the work. I think that it's important for me, like all of these works are very planned, as I had said in the earlier. And so I wanted to let the viewer understand a little bit more about how these are very controlled works. So I'm still working with these sort of striped motifs, and this was for a space that was very small, and so it was meant to sort of be walked around. And so it was the viewer was sort of supposed to pace around this this figure, and it was called "Standing on the Edge of Time," which is a lyric from Mandy by Barry Manilow. And so I thought of that as being that sort of circular logic of like the sort of performance of being in the closet. And it was just sort of, again, a sort of fun exploration of the sort of understanding of trying to control color. And so from there, I was able to I was asked to basically do this work at Performance Space. This was last year in September of 2019, which feels like a world ago. But this just came down in January. So I was really excited to be able to sort of, again, use everything that I had been working with to sort of create this environment. And so I knew that I had wanted to control the color again, but I wanted to be more intentional with this work. So I was trying to think of different color combinations, and the ugliest that I could think of was red and green, which are obviously Christmas colors. So I was curious of what that lineage was with that sort of specific color combination within historization. So red and green were actually used traditionally as a way to divide the priest and the worshiper in medieval churches. And it really wasn't until a very specific 1930s Coca-Cola ad that established this very specific language of Christmas. So I liked this idea of sort of capitalism hijacking something that was very sort of worshiping and religious to basically sell this idea of like coziness and comfort and Christmas. So I had wanted to do something that related to this idea of like collective delusion. And so that color combination really felt like it made a way into what I needed to do. So this was the most ambitious work that I've done, and it included sort of these shag pieces as well as some hand woven panels, which you can see that they're in there, and then tufted works. And so I wanted the tufted pieces to, again, sort of look like these sort of stained glass windows, and then also continue to use the iconography that I had been using prior from the Loresipan. So again, I wanted to take a lot of these pieces that I had been working with and then turn them into something else. So the ruined pieces were actually able to be sat upon, and people could touch the works that were here. It was incredibly activated. Working with Performance Space was amazing in that I was able to curate intentional activations like readings and performances. And then also it was out of my hands and into the institutions. Like there were readings that took place, there were community meetings, there was a lesbian Halloween party that happened there. There was a whole host of different things that happened here. And that I think is ultimately what I wanted in terms of creating an environment that enabled people to really have this sort of incredible experience and communal experience as well. So yeah, so here's more images of this. Okay, so that takes us to this year. So this was going to be a really crazy year for me. Like I had like a spreadsheet of everything that was happening. I was so excited. I had been invited to Lima to do a a solo exhibition at Museo Mate, which basically I had been dreaming of my entire career. And so I had been working with I like really a lot of momentum. I knew what I wanted to do. The use of paint really made me feel liberated in this way, where suddenly I felt like I could be so much more intentional about how I fill the space rather than just having to make a million things to create it. And so I was very excited to sort of have an exhibition there. And I had wanted to do basically this like large pile of rocks to talk about sort of this idea of pilgrimage and that sort of like practice of stacking rocks for good luck, as well as sort of like that religious sort of sensibility. And basically a week before the show was supposed to open, the president of Peru closed the entire country. And so it was very intense, like literally everything closed. The only thing open were grocery stores and pharmacies and banks. There were no private cars that were allowed on the street. Basically, when I was able to leave, there was a gendered curfew. Only men could be out on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Only women could be out Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. No one was out on Sunday. It was very intense. And so I was almost done with the show, but literally had needed to get material that Monday, and he had closed the country on Sunday. So I basically had to just finish with what I had. And so in terms of it being finished in a way that I felt 100% certain of, I did not feel that. I think especially when you have such a material understanding, it's not something they are used to. But oh, that's it. But basically, I don't know what's going to happen and when that's going to be able to be installed. But since then, I'm sort of understanding that the work that I was making before, I'm not going to be able to anymore. I think the idea of touching work is no longer clean or hygienic. And so I think that is going to be a really interesting change. But of course, if we've learned anything from this year, it's that everything is needing to change and we have no choice. And so, so yeah, so that's where I'm at. Thank you so much.
Awesome. That was such a great presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So we're going to be taking some questions now. I see some already in the chat, so I'll address those. But if you have a question, you can type it right in there, and I'll ask them to Sarah. All right, so our first question addressed what you mentioned just now about touching the work, how that has changed in the current scenario that we're in.
Yeah.
So our second question comes from Amy. They ask, how long did If I Could take you to create? It is stunning and overwhelming in the best sense of these words.
Thank you. Well, I made that work basically in about 2 months of like long days. I was fortunate enough to receive a grant. I applied for another grant and got that show basically like funded from the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. Again, when you have an idea, I absolutely think that you should apply for funding. That's something that's very important and been very helpful for me. But it was a lot of work. And I think that was also a really important show in terms of learning how to work. When you're sort of working with group shows and then sort of having your first solo show, I think it really does teach you a lot in terms of delegation and what's possible, and really how to work within your practice of what's realistic.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Sarah. They say, thank you so much for sharing your incredible body of work, but also the reservations and failures you've had along the way. I'm wondering if you could comment on what it was about being in school that felt restrictive.
Very good question. I've been thinking about this a lot. I was telling one of the students today, I had the pleasure and displeasure of throwing away a lot of figure drawings from undergrad. And I think it really reminded me how mediocre of an art student I was. Like I really, I wasn't a good drawer, that's for sure. But I think that school for me, I don't know if it was just being close to home or if it was just sort of not, I think I just didn't count it as my life. I think when I was in school, I was so eager for my life to start. And, or at least that's upon reflecting on those memories, that's what it felt like. And I think that I think I was just so excited to learn about so many other alternative histories when I moved and came to New York and met people who were so intelligent and just so interested in philosophy or queer theory or critical theory. And I had never met someone like that. And I had never thought that I was smart because it didn't interest me. So I think that it was just that structure. And I think that being out of school, the like Capricorn in me like really kicked in, and I was like, it's a do or die situation, because working without the prompts of school is very different. And it does take time to sort of get used to working within that mode. So I think that really kicked in for me, where I was like, I know I want to be an artist, and this is my only choice.
Gotcha. Yeah, I definitely relate to that as someone coming out of undergrad and wondering what's happening with my life. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's reassuring to hear, people reflect on their experiences and that other people have been through it too. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
We have another question from Jen. She says, I find that the research of your work is so interesting and involved. I'm wondering what consistently fuels your research. What advice do you have for artists working today and students when it comes to research?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I think the work is very personal, and the baseline is always sort of like melding the two cultures of American and Peruvian through the lens of textiles. And I think that that's always what keeps it interesting for me. I think the history of textiles is very interesting to me, and there are so many like strange complications, as well as religion. I think religion for me is something that is endlessly interesting. And though I am not a Christian, I'm very protective of it, because I think it's very easy to sort of like be critical of it when it is very complicated and so much of our world is based upon it. And so for me, I want to use my knowledge of it to be critical of it. And especially as like the administration has and the conservative right has militarized Christianity, I think it's important for me to really understand it and also understand its flaws and shortcomings and what's being ignored from it. And so I think in terms of researching, I think you are able to find what interests you. And or that's a poorly worded sentence, but what I mean is that as long as you have a connection to it, you're always going to find what you need. I'm a firm believer in that because it's always your point of view and you're always searching for something that you're interested in. So it's always going to like feed itself. I know whenever I'm researching like a new work, I'm like, wow, I really got lucky that these things connected in this way. But I really think that if you're following what you're interested in and what you want to talk about, that's always going to happen. You're always going to find those connections. But I am also a firm believer in going to libraries. The internet is incredibly reductive in terms of what is available online. And so the library system in New York is incredible. And also just finding strange books is really amazing. And I am a firm believer in book learning because there's so little sometimes of these like tiny parts of history that's available online.
Gotcha. And we have a quick question from Christine who asks if that piece you were working on is still in Peru.
It is still in Peru. So the picture that we're looking at, this is literally like the little house that I was living in where I was also working. I like kind of had to leave it installed so they would know. And I just got an email from the curator from the museum that they're hoping to install it hopefully soon. There's ceramics that were also made that were finished like this week. So they're trying to get it done. Peru is slowly reopening, but we shall see. I hope that it's going to be installed. Literally, like the space is done. Like the floor vinyl was installed. The walls were painted. Like everything was done. And it was just, you know, it changed. So, which is fine. It's what happened truly worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Man, that's such a bummer. I'm sure distant in Peru, it looks beautiful.
Yeah, I love it.
So I had a question. In the beginning, you mentioned applying for grants and having to write about your work.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if you discovered something about your work that you weren't aware of by writing about it or just talking about that process of writing about your own work.
I think for me, writing about it really, writing was a way for me to feel very concrete in what I was trying to say. I think when writing an artist statement is so different than talking about work. I hate writing artist statements. It's something that drives me nuts, but it is mandatory. You do have to do it. But writing about work feels exciting and sort of like makes the ideas become more solidified and sort of, I think it's very directional. And so for me, I feel like reading and writing is the beginning of every work because I need to know why I'm doing it. And I like everything to be very intentional. So I think that's why grants have been very helpful for me because one, I mean, thankfully I got some funding. I've also gotten turned down a million times. It always happens. But it was also helpful for me to really understand what I was doing. And even just looking back, like when I received that first grant right out of school, like I was reading like what I had written and it was talking about how like obsessive I am in materials. And I think again, like being able to give myself permission to be as like meticulous and obsessive and intricate as I wanted to, that was very liberating in this way. So I think writing is a really important way for you to become acquainted with what you want to talk about. And also in terms of my writing practice of like the foot erotica, that was really helpful for me when I had just moved to New York. I was impossibly broke. And I wanted to really create these sort of fantasies. And writing is a way that is free and you can create whatever world you want. And so that was a way for me to really access something that I was not able to achieve. And I also want to reiterate that when I moved to New York, a year after I moved, I got a job at this yarn company, and that job really enabled me to work in a scale that I would not have been able to. And so I think that it's important to talk about day jobs. That's very important, but also working within your means. I am completely against people buying expensive equipment or expensive materials because you think that that's like what is going to make your work really pop off, when you just have to, it's your ideas that are the most expensive, and that's what you should really invest in, and then think about ways that you can achieve them with what you have available.
That's great advice, thank you. Okay, we're nearing 6 o'clock, so if anybody has any last minute burning questions, you can type them in the chat. I'll give everyone a second if anyone has any last minute questions. We have a last minute question from Dory. So you addressed how touch played a role in your work, but how that might be different now. And Dory's curious about how you're thinking about an adaptation to that, if that would still be an element, or just how you're thinking about touch in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking about how it can sort of be retained. I've thought about sort of the works now existing within these like plexi coverings. But I think for the most part, I'm ready to let it go and work on a different part of the space. Like I was very interested in the floor for a long time. And I think now I'm becoming more interested in like the top of walls. And so I'm just trying to think about what can be safe. And again, rather than just trying to make it work, I want to try and make it an intentional move as to why it's laterally moving in terms of like the concept of it. So I'm a little sad, but I'm also like, there's so much to be sad about right now. And I think that's okay.
Awesome. All right, so it's 6 o'clock. I'm going to conclude the program today. Once again, thank you everybody for attending this week's Visiting Artist Program lecture with Sarah Zapata. We truly hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Let's give Sarah a virtual round of applause. And we look forward to seeing you again soon for our next lecture tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.